take a clip of an interesting point in the long video and put it in the beginning and just like have that be the teaser, and then have like a little introduction afterwards, or not.
Right.
That could serve as the introduction. Super fundamental like concept stuff. These are like that's the thing. Like yin and yang is so basic, but like Tao is basic because it's so basic that it can't have a name. You can't even say it.
Ley line is like there's a thing, and then through line is now it's going somewhere. Like to get very esoteric.
Like
it. So it's
it
like
is,
a thing is dry, and then the through line for dry is like it can become wet.
Yes. You're getting it. You're getting it.
Yeah.
This is one of those things that it's like you have to just like say examples because it's very obvious. It's so obvious.
It's annoying because it's like when people try to describe like Taoism and stuff.
Yes.
Like, the only lesson books or like explanation books, they're just a collection of like these annoying stories.
Yeah.
And you have to like just try and get it. That's all the definition process.
And now it's recording, and I'm going to be editing this, so which I'm not super happy about. The reason why I decided editing is worthwhile is because we can like gather our thoughts. But I feel like we can, starting out especially, it might be beneficial to like cut a lot of the fat out, because there's going to be more fat in any early project, if that makes sense.
Especially because the way that we tend to have conversations, we're both very comfortable with dead space in the conversation.
That too.
Think.
Yep.
And for listeners, that's probably not as enjoyable. So like the little in-betweens of us figuring out like articulation, it's probably going to be nice to just be able to cut out the actual dead silence and skip to the parts where we're at least trying to form words.
Yeah, and I think also because we're seeing each other, that helps like not make the dead silence be nothing. It's just silence. Whereas when you're listening only with audio, dead silence is literally nothing because it's only audio. Right. You were talking to me about how so-and-so, who was it? Who were you talking about?
The guy who I just name dropped was Nassim Taleb.
Nassim Taleb.
Yeah, who he wrote a series of books. There's, I believe, technically 4, but really like the main thoughts are in a trilogy. And I finished the first one the other day, which is Fooled by Randomness. And he has a very like fascinating worldview to me. And he's like highly into the aesthetics of like how he frames the things that he talks about, and like the style of, is it highly technical or is it like more philosophical or whatever. And for all of those reasons, I think you would definitely enjoy reading his work, if for nothing else than just to like get a little taste of how the dude views writing and like putting work out into the world. Yeah, so the main point that's been sticking with me after reading like Fooled by Randomness is just how like we all make so many decisions in life based off of like really small sample sets of data, like a single point or 2 points. I had just said before we started recording how like you're happy you had another one of those sleepless nights of like inspiration where you have like another game like tabletop that you're a good way started on, and how this is the second one now that's happened with, and you're like, this is cool, like I'm kind of like, it's not just a one-off thing now, right? Like I've got two data points is so much better than just one data point.
A point is, one is just a point, but 2 draws a line. That actually segues into the question that I sort of wanted to field by you, which is actually the reason, that the impetus as to why I asked you to do this today. And the question, so jumping off of the point from like, is it philosophical or is it like practical, I think you said? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was the dichotomy. And the question that I want to ask you though is, do you believe there are things in the cosmos that are outside of physics? The cosmos or like the multiverse? Like, does everything follow the laws of physics that we can understand? Or are there things that literally are completely outside of that? There might be a given that is like like cosmically true, that like just is true. You know what I mean? Like it's, the universe doesn't abide to like logic necessarily. It could just be true, right? Like, are there any givens that are outside of physics?
Yeah, I think my answer to this is like, I think there's a few levels on which there's like a yes or no answer, and my answer is yes on every one of those levels.
Wow, really?
So, one level in which I interpret that is like, is the current set of laws of physics as we understand them, like, correct or not, right? So, like, and my
Hmm.
thinking is they're not totally correct, right? Like, science has progressed by, like, progresses by funerals, right? Like, one
Hmm.
person's new
Wow.
theory kills the last person's theory that was like the standard for a while. Yeah, so inevitably we're gonna find out like the place that we have the fence posts right now, and like our orienting axioms are gonna shift over time.
Hmm.
We understand stuff better and differently,
That's a really interesting
and
point.
I'm sure that there's things that are currently outside of those fence posts and boundaries which mess with us, which we will come to include eventually, right? And so like those are things that are outside right now, but maybe they won't always be. And for a lot of people, that's kind of how they regard like a lot of superstitious phenomena, like ghosts
Hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
weird like spiritual stuff that is a little bit more tangible than like the truly esoteric.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think there's like different striations of, right? There's like you could go off into like astral projection kind of
Yeah.
spiritualism, or you can be in
Parallel
like a
planes,
relatively
intersecting
yeah
parallel planes.
yeah, or you can get into like relatively mundane, like, there's readings that we can't really explain on like these radars or
Mm-hmm.
something.
An interesting interpretation of the question too is, are there also parallel forms of physics, like maybe the physics that we have to abide to within this cosmos, that we can interface with, even within maybe this cosmos there's other physics that just are parallel and don't intersect and don't overlap.
Yeah, I think it's all possible. I think like even to say yes to that much is to be a yes to your original question of is there stuff
Interesting.
outside of our laws of physics, right? Because
Hmm.
that's a very specific set of rules, and I think you very quickly can find yourself outside of them when you're thinking of things long.
One of the reasons why I'm drawn to podcasts is, I guess, this is sort of like taking a page from Plato. I like to ask questions because I want to see where you're coming from, what you think. Because I'm starting to realize that I think I'm just naturally very agnostic compared to most people. Like, I face these questions and I'm just like, oh yeah, this could be possible, that could be possible, but I don't like lean to any of them. I'm just like, this could be fun or more cool if this is true. But ultimately, my conclusion is I don't know. I don't know,
Yeah.
right? But I think other people tend to like lean a certain way, which sort of goes back to your initial point of like our biases and people just like, oh, I wasn't proven wrong yet, so I'm probably right. Like people just sort
Right.
of lean towards that. Like I'm the kind of person who's like, oh, I haven't been proven wrong yet, so I might still be wrong. Which is I think a fundamentally different kind of way to go about life.
It's also how strongly people hold to convictions in
Mm,
general. Like, because you could be one of those people that's like, yeah, like it's not true until it's proven definitely to be true. And you can take a very agnostic approach to that and say like, yeah, probably not, but like
mm-hmm.
maybe it could be. Or you could be super rigid about like, no, it is not,
Yeah, yeah,
unless you really fucking prove to me
yeah.
that it is.
One of the ways I can take that answer is science may be too far into the I don't know field where there's just like I could be proven wrong, right? Because like counterintuitively, a lot of people that aren't in the scientific disciplines, they tend to be like, oh, science people are so pretentious, they know everything, they're so correct and they're always right or whatever. But it's actually the inverse. Science is builds that confidence by constantly thinking that they're wrong, trying to prove that they're wrong. And so far, this thing hasn't been proven wrong, but they're open to it being wrong.
The key point being science is like that, right? Like
Mm,
capital S science, but
yeah.
scientists in the individual
Yes.
specific, absolutely not.
True. That is a great distinction, actually. Because there are religious people in the scientific fields. And in fact,
Yeah,
science, as we know it, was developed in Christianity, honestly, historically speaking.
like
The funding for a lot of like the lenses, the experiments, the thinkers, all of these have to have patrons and, financial support and
a
stuff
lot of
like
that
that.
early on was like church
Yeah.
funded, like patron.
Which is sort of unfair because the church in the past was sort of this monopoly of all power.
Yeah, I
You know,
think yeah, it's almost a reflection of just like how pervasive they were
yeah,
at the point in time of
yeah,
like
like why leaves are green, because green is less effective for absorbing white light, but that just happened to be true and happened to be the way it worked in this iteration of life. So that is just what is true, not because it's the right way or the best way. That just like, that's how it happened, right? And I think that is more akin to like why religion and Christianity specifically like was the birthplace for science, not because it was the best place.
That's interesting. I'd want to read more about that. I have a feeling like that's the type of thing that'll make a lot of people fucking hold up their finger and be like, hold on, you're way the fuck off on this.
Yeah. It's an interesting field. I think one of the things I was inspired by with Lex Friedman's podcast was like, oh, there can be sort of like distinct like breaks in like topic, right? We can talk like that, which is sort of nice though, because I might want to have like multiple things to talk about, you know, especially if I like long form stuff. If there aren't natural tangents into like to have a diverse field of things to talk about, it might just be like this one thing that's important and we talk about it, but we never get off of it and it becomes overwhelming. And like this happens sometimes in podcasts, like long form podcasts like Joe Rogan's, where it's like the guest comes in and like, oh, typically when they're talking with other comedians, right? Like there's no like thing that they want to talk about and bullet points that they want to cover. So there's no like way to like have these non-discrete jumps in topics. And they're sort of forced now into like, since there's no easy way to get out of it, they just stay in this one topic. And lately that's been happening more with COVID because it's like so serious and so pronounced that it's like, oh, we just need to talk about COVID. Just more things to talk about COVID, more COVID points. Like 2 hours go by and they're both like exhausted of talking about the same topic, but they can't get out of it because it's so important and so prevalent.
Or just you get into that rut conversational mental wise where you just can't think outside of it. That is one of the nice parts about like if you're speaking with somebody who you've got prepared topics with, or like at least a check sheet you can go back to.
Yeah.
And just be like, all right, taking a step back.
Yeah.
There's this thing I want to talk about.
Yeah. With that said, so the next thing that I wanted to ask you, which is maybe loosely, I can try to make a segue if I want, but so if I were to try to attempt to segue this, I guess, is on the note of not being sure of anything of yourself, I wanted to ask you this question. And we talked about, outside of the podcast, off record, this interplay between sort of like Buddhist philosophies and Christian philosophies of like Buddhist being like just accept and Christian being sort of like do something about it and help your brothers and sisters or whatever. And I think I'm sort of struggling with, and I sense that you're struggling too on this like, the Buddhist point of this is the way it is and we just have to accept it and there's going to be misery and just sort of like be stoic about it. And like stoicism has to do with Diogenes. But the thing is, there is some truth in the philosophy of helping out and, you know, proselytizing and stuff. And the question that I wanted to ask you is, do you think Diogenes, looking back on his life, was proud of his life, or would have been proud of his life?
Can you remind me who Diogenes?
Diogenes was the, how do I say, like, ultimate version of the stoicist, who lived in a big barrel, had a bowl, wooden bowl, and he like was like, oh my god, he was
quote with the one.
Yeah, he went to the river and there was a kid that was drinking out of the river with his hand, and Diogenes is like, oh my god, how materialistic I've become, and he like smashes his only worldly possession, the wooden bowl, onto the ground. It's like, oh my god, how vain of me to think that I needed this possession of a wooden bowl. It's like, and he like doesn't even have like fucking clothes.
The like move out of my son guy.
Yeah, with Alexander the Great, exactly. That's a famous tale of Diogenes with Alexander the Great that you can look up. That's great, and we've talked about before, and I'm sure you probably already know about, most listeners. But basically, Alexander the Great meets with Diogenes and sort of pays his respects. He like shows like, oh damn, like Diogenes is sort of dope. And I think the quote goes, if I were not Alexander the Great, I would want to be Diogenes too. And Diogenes responds with, I too, if I were Alexander the Great, would want to be Diogenes too. If I were not Diogenes, I would want to be Diogenes. And the thing is, like, that's when he's alive, right? And this is the reason why I'm asking those. Looking back on his life, like afterwards, like with the sum total having been able to have been taken into account, the document that is the scroll that is your life in the gates of heaven or whatever, right? You can look at it and be like, oh yeah, you were right that nothing mattered and etc. But look at all this like happiness that you didn't do, like give to other people. Like you didn't help this person that you could have helped here. You didn't do this thing that could have helped this person here. You could have made this person's life better, etc. etc. But instead, you chose to arguably be selfish, right? And in the sense, like in the Buddhist sense, also they sort of like answer that by saying there is no self. We're just a cosmos. It's a we. It's an uppercase us thing, big us in the cosmos thing. But I feel like that's a little bit, you know, glossing over the fact that we could do a lot more to help each other and help the world. And maybe looking back on his life, Diogenes, if he took account all of these things, like maybe he wouldn't have been proud that he sort of did quote unquote nothing.
I mean, for the way that he's represented in history, I would almost have to assume that he was not like the type of personality that would feel that kind of regret. Because I don't think you're able to like live that life that he did. You're predisposed to that type of thought. He was pretty committed to the whole like, you know, taking things as they come, living life in the public square, just like dominant, being very content with that life. You know.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, huh? Right? Like,
right.
If you were Diogenes looking back on your life of what Diogenes did, would you be proud? And it's sort of weird though, right? Because like there's so many philosophers that look up to him even now, right? Like to have the impact even now as a philosopher that quote unquote did nothing is like, oh wow, that's sort of a lot more than a lot of people and most people that ever existed and has passed away could say about their lives. But like I said before, like would you be proud that you sort of did nothing?
Yeah. I think like me personally, no. And I don't think I would get that far, right? Like what stops me at this very moment from going and doing that, right? Like the option is always there. The barrier to entry to live that life is not high. It is the opposite.
The checklist of the barrier to entry is, are you alive? If yes, you can do this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, unless you want to quantify like all the things that you'd be giving up as your barrier to entry, which maybe is accurate.
Yeah, that's the difficult part, right? It's this being tied to our worldly possessions, and the more ingrained you get, the harder it is to get out.
And that's
it's
like
inertia.
the Buddhistic side to it, right? It's like it's all these attachments that you have
Yeah.
to like all of these things that are part of like your identity and your life and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Man.
And you're right. Like there's a tension between following that type of path. I feel like a lot of the time, and also like being a good person.
Yes, that's something that I do want to expound upon a little bit, right? Like the concept of being a good person. So yeah, the question that I want to ask you now is, what does it mean to be a good person? Quote unquote good. Emphasis on good. What the fuck is good?
To me, like, best you can do is a personal definition. And I think my personal definition has always been to be kind to the people around me and try and be, I'm trying not to make like a circumferential reference and just say like be good to the people around you, or like leave things in a better place, because once again it's just what is good, what is better.
Yeah, circular definitions.
All that sort of circular logic.
Yeah.
So to try and escape that, I think it's just all about like being kind to the people around you. And that's all it really comes down to. I have like more of a personal philosophy just in terms of like keeping myself sane. That is more of like a tend to the part of the garden you can touch type deal. Because I think it's very easy, especially with like how far we can reach in terms of our like consumption of media and our like sight of the world around us. It's really, really easy to set your sights on some crazy, lofty ideas of like what things are within your reach to be able to like hope and to like out upon.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's definitely been a place where I've gotten like found myself in a trap before, where it's just like you get demoralized because you're trying to like affect this change over way too big of an area, and like the amount of influence that you have. I
Yeah.
think like I've found myself much happier in life when instead of trying to like go on crusades against the world at large or whatever salient point I feel like is relevant, I instead just like take a step back and just like buy a friend a meal
Mm.
and like make sure that they're doing well.
Yeah. I think the point that I struggle with is, or another way to look at this is, in the attempt to try to do better, you do nothing, right? There's the quote
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
"Perfect is the enemy of good."
Just got to get stuff done sometimes, and like a good thing is still good. It doesn't matter how big or small it is. Like
Yeah.
it's still meaningful.
Yeah. Just to recap a couple points that I'm hearing is kind and kindness, and the way I would like break that down is sort of like do unto others as you would want done to yourself, right? The golden rule and such.
Sorry.
Um, the something that I've been struggling with or thinking a lot about is, especially with today's cancel culture and today's sort of like just vitriol within discourse, the lack of good, there's like no more, or not no more, this is a little bit hyperbolic, but the lack of good faith conversation between people across parties, like
Yeah.
I think there's so much, I think there's so much of a personal, like sort of going back to what you said before, like everyone has a sort of bias how they face the world. Everyone sees things differently, right? And there's no one true like thing that is true, right? Like even like what you intend to say and what you mean and your intentions and all that stuff like isn't the only thing that matters, and arguably not even the majority of what matters, right? And it's the impact, but there's also different impacts and different subjective ways that people interact with whatever thing you put out there. But a thing that I've been struggling with is one of these things that, how do I say it? In short, I believe the concept of good has sort of been weaponized in modern times. The sense of like moving the goalpost or no true Scotsman, like these fallacies of like, oh, you're woke, but you're not woke enough. Oh, you care about people, but you don't care about these people enough. Oh, you're a good person, but you're not good enough. You know what I mean? Like it's been sort of weaponized where because good is sort of like, in a sense, like the problem with better and more, right? There's always more.
Yeah, it's a comparative term.
Exactly. It's comparative, and it's never
Or at least
satisfying.
it's become very comparative.
Yeah.
Maybe good in and of itself shouldn't be, but it's often yeah, it often is that.
Yeah. And do you have any thoughts on the idea of good being weaponized?
I mean, I totally get what you're referencing. Like, I think there's not much room, or it doesn't feel like there's much room for like forgiveness or space for people to get things way to being right. There's a lot of, I don't know, maybe justified, but maybe not like righteous anger to go around.
Hmm.
I think it can be scary sometimes have a conversation and not be sure if like you have the space to work your thought out correctly, or like to articulate something, and knowing that you're not going to get the benefit of the doubt and feeling that pressure. So it's like, if I don't say this exactly right, I'm gonna get crucified out here.
Yeah, which is
And
that's
I don't know.
the problem with anything being like, I guess, weaponized in the way that I put it before. When it's too volatile, like you have to be too careful, and if you're too careful, you might not even. Which sort of goes back to the perfect being the enemy of good. Like when you have to be perfect, it has to be excellent, or else you your career ends, or you get fired and you lose your job and you have kids or whatever, right? There's
Yeah,
too many
think
consequences.
the way that I feel this pressure the most often is just in like group settings or like public settings, like at work or whatever. Like when somebody, when you're like having a conversation with coworkers or with the group, it has like a vaguely political element,
Yeah.
and you start to feel everybody get really nervous because they don't know each other in a political context
Yeah.
or know anybody's political leanings,
Yeah.
and just like how high tension.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just even as you brush against something that might be going to a political place, it's almost tangible. Like
Yeah.
I don't think it should have to be
Yeah.
that scary, but that's the place where I feel like most people can probably like get in touch with what it is that I'm talking about, because it's not like everybody's having conversations about political stuff, because political stuff doesn't fucking matter most of the time. It's like
true.
It's not a part of everybody's normal discourse, but I think
Day
like
to day.
in those moments where there's like a tangential aspect that goes there and everybody's suddenly on like fucking, like they're on the bomb squad of some like defusal
Fight or
team.
flight. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems really what does that say about us, or
Yeah.
like about the state of the public discourse, that everybody is that worried about it in that like much of a tangible way. And I think that's where I lament that there's not more room to like I'll call it make a mistake because I don't know the better way to say it, but it's just like, what is it, that thing that everybody's getting scared about? Because
Yeah.
I don't think anybody in those conversations, like any of my coworkers or anybody, is like a bad person.
Yeah.
All.
Yeah.
And I don't think they think that of me.
Yeah.
But we're still, for some reason, all worried that one of us is gonna like say something
Yeah.
that is gonna result in like losing, I guess, like a friendship or a job, or
Yeah.
like making things super awkward, or I don't know. Like
Yeah.
when you dissect it, it doesn't make much sense.
Like, in the sense of like the state of how society has sort of degraded to in the past couple years. And on the note of like, you don't think that your coworkers are bad people, and you might even think that they're good people, but it's sort of like what we are saying before of like, but are they a good enough person? Like, are you a good person, but a good person that might let slip hate speech sometimes by accident in like small company or whatever, right? Like accidentally or whatever, and like you might still be in general a good person, but if you do this, now cancel culture has dictated that you must be canceled, right? And you can't associate with the people that even do these things, because then now that's like not good on you, and you can say what you will about virtue signaling and stuff like that, and to virtual signal to like prove that you are good enough, and then that is the new standard that everyone else has to live up to, and it's a race to the bottom. But I think the one that's relevant right now is on the note of like, you don't want to hurt people's feelings, I guess, essentially.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it comes from a good place a lot of
Yeah.
the time, that it's like, yeah, the reason for some of that tension,
Yeah, I think the thing that I want to ask though is, do feelings matter too much right now? Like, I think there's been this, the pendulum swings both ways, right? But the pendulum sometimes swings back the other way because it needs to correct, and then there's an overcorrection, and then it needs to correct with the overcorrection, and that's the pendulum swinging back and forth, right?
That's like,
And I feel like, culturally speaking, societally, we've come to the answer that feelings do matter. Feelings are important. Subjective case matters. But I think society has sort of overcorrected, and now we need to correct the overcorrection, because I think feelings matter too much. You can be, in a sense, like, and this is the previous point that I wanted to get at, of what's the difference between good, right, and correct? There's this interplay, there's this dance, and there's like too much tension now of like, you can be a good person, you can be right and correct, but now sometimes it's tough, because if you say the correct thing, it makes you not a good person, right? Like all of these things about like, oh, like for example, the elephant in the room, right, of like COVID. It's like, oh, and vaccines and vaccine hesitancy. It's like, it would be good for everyone to take the vaccine in broad strokes and then we can just get over with it and get back to our lives, right? That's the quote unquote good thing, and that's the narrative that the left is like really like trying to push home, that like fuck vaccine hesitancy, like everyone just get vaccinated, let's get this over with, let's work together.
Solve everything.
But the thing is, there's a point that is literally correct. That is, there's a certain subset of cases that, you know, people literally die, or, you know, other terrible
It's almost
conditions.
taboo to mention within some circles because it's seen as like fueling vaccine hesitancy and
Right.
that kind
Right, which is, you know, right or whatever. That does happen. But the thing is, like, I don't want to live in a world where we can only do what the mob dictates is good, and you can't even speak out for what is correct or what is right. Like, sort of right, I would say, in the sense of comparing good, right, and correct. Right is sort of the fine line that is between good and correct. Like, good is sort of what I would say is like the broad strokes, like the aggregate whole, like how it helps people on the long term. And correct is like, in this specific case, in the short term of right now, for just me, this is correct. Like, this is the fact, this is like the data point shows. And right is this dance between like, okay, yeah, would be better for everyone. In this case, it's tough, and the right answer is all of this nuance and whatever.
Yeah. I mean, those are very hard terms to like hone in on, you know?
Yeah.
But I think you can at least
It's like defining the word the.
that they can be at odds, you know?
Yeah. Sorry, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it's like defining the word the. Like, what does the mean? Like, what? Like, what does is mean? Like, what? I don't know. Those are just words. Like, what are you talking about? What does good mean? Good is just not bad. Like,
adjectives and nouns, that way people understand what's going on. I don't know.
it's tough. It's like, it's so, like, ubiquitous, but so it's like, what? This is the thing that defines everything. Like, how do you have a word that defines and is used to define everything? Like, how do you define that word? Because definitionally, that's the word that used to define everything. Then how do you define? Like, it must define itself then.
That type of grammar and stuff that you're zeroing in on is why people say that you think differently depending on what your native language is. Right?
Yeah.
Because the way that things are framed, generally, like on very meta level, is informed by like prepositionary phrases and articles and like the context of how the grammar of the sentences works. So it shifts the thought pattern that you have. I mean, that's just a really weird fact of like language.
Just the way our brains work. Which which leads me to the third section of the podcast that I want to get to, which is mindless and random meandering through conversation. Right? So, like, first 2 points are like sort of concrete and questions or whatever, and the third one's like, all right, cool, let's just like talk and hang out, and like maybe there'll be something interesting or funny that we stumble upon, or interesting things that we want to mention. And on the note of, like, this is just the way our brains work, I literally, right before speaking with you today, I was just watching this video talking about how people process vision differently. And on the topic of aphantasia, I believe the term is, the inability to imagine something visually in the mind's eye. Like, there is no mind's eye. Your mind's eye is blind, is what it means to have aphantasia. And I'm sort of reminded of like the differences that we have in the way that we interact with the world and that we like see and perceive the world. Like, you know, I could talk about synesthesia, right? And the thing is, the video and the studies have shown from exploring aphantasia, it sort of shows that there's different parts in your brain, right? And it goes to talk about and which leads me to think about we are multitudes and etc., but I digress. And there's different parts of our brain that do different functions, and they're sort of segmented but also interconnected. And your eyes are actually a part of that. So there's like the input. Like, you know me, I love to break things down into inputs and outputs. So there's the inputs of what you literally see, visual stuff, this light spectrum. There's input of that. But that input then gets outputted and input into a different part of your brain. And that part of there's different parts of these brains and it's interconnected. But a few of these parts are like responsible for saying what you're looking at, where it is that you're looking at, where it is in compared to other things that you're looking at. Like, not just like color and shape, but like way more of stuff, right? And like, as we all know, like faces is like actually a large part of our brains like processing like concern. And it's so interesting that aphantasia might be like the lack of the what part. Like that's just like weaker, or like other interconnected parts of it. And so obviously glossing over a lot of the nuance, but basically it could be like that what is it that you're looking at that, and you can store and recall and like have that be like triggered to like be the output of like, this is what you see, like these are things in your mind. Like the question that is often brought up is, when you imagine an apple, where is that apple? Like not the apple that you like referenced,
the
like,
idea of
yeah,
apple,
that, yeah,
in a place,
yeah,
or,
like
yeah.
your brains are chemicals, right? So you thought something. Where's that thought in terms of the chemicals? It's sort of like
I
a
thought
wild
you
question,
came
right?
to, like the mental image side of like, okay, you have this what of apple, so I have in my head right now, I know like apple.
Yeah.
Is there built around that? Does that apple exist in a time or a place or anything, or is it just the what?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. But the question I was getting at is like, literally, there's chemicals in your brain and neurons firing and synapses like triggering and stuff like that. Like that thought. Like what are the neurons doing that? What's the chemical that like literally like is the through point of all of that? What's the soul of that thought, and where is it?
I was listening to a podcast with Andrew Huberman.
And
he's big into like the whole visual cortex.
Yeah.
And he was talking about some research that was done, I think specifically with faces, where they were able to show that like a specific face was actually related to a specific neuron firing in somebody's brain. So there was actually like, this is the neuron that is like recognition of this particular face or something. I hope I'm remembering that correctly, because that was my takeaway.
I can verify that claim actually, because I remember exactly that video or that paper, or maybe it was a different video, but I remember the paper that they were referencing, and they studied like the example in the paper was people have a Jennifer Aniston gene, or not gene, sorry, people have a Jennifer Aniston neuron or synapse, what have you, right?
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily in the same place specifically for everyone, but like consistently whenever you have a thought of Jennifer Aniston, or if you see Jennifer Aniston, or you are reminded of a movie that Jennifer Aniston is in, or a meme about Jennifer Aniston, right?
Now the fucking, the meme of like, this guy's living rent-free in my head right now.
Yeah, Jennifer Aniston neuron is living rent-free in your neuron, right? Yeah. But potentially also not rent-free, right? Because the thing is, the rent that the neuron would be paying, though, I mean, I get the joke and I love the meme, but to over-explain the joke to make a new joke of it, I guess, is the rent that the neuron is paying might actually be significant. Because, like, the strength in which, like, that sector of your brain and how strong they are and how big they are or whatever can, like, potentially be an indicator or, like, an effect from... effect for or against aphantasia. Like if it's stronger, that ability to recall Jennifer Aniston. Like I can say Jennifer Aniston, and you can see like straight blondish brown hair and this kind of face and these kind of features or whatever, and like body of this kind type or whatever, and what shows and movies that they're in.
It provides an anchor for the what part of like that what muscle.
Yes.
Brain, so to speak.
Yes. Like every neuron is also an anchor. That's a great point. Which brings me to a philosophy or like a concept that I think I ran by you briefly before that I'm really there's a lot to it, because it's potentially literally tied to like everything. It's similar to like a yin and yang kind of like basic potentially, right? And unfortunately, yin and yang is great because that sort of nailed what it is like to have like two basic things. But another take of two basic things in this kind of akin to yin and yang is two terms that I'm trying to work with. Is the terms that I have currently, the working terms are ley line and through line. So
What's a ley line?
a ley line, like I was inspired of like, like something that doesn't move, and like the pyramids or the Stonehenge or whatever like that. It's like a ley line, because like I said, it's basically yin and yang, right? Like what is Tao, right? What is the way, right? It's like, oh fuck, you can't name the way, or else it's not the way, right? And it's more basic than the words and the essence of way. Anyway, your question of, so what is it? A ley line, so I have to answer both, what a ley line and a through line is, right? Because there's that interconnected. Yeah. So a ley line is a seed, and the through line is the stem or the roots or whatever, the thing that's growing from the seed, right?
Okay.
I need to give you like a bunch of examples, and it'll be very clear, right?
So is it like reference point and then thing that
like point and line, seed and stem, plus to minus, empty to full, like dry, like osmosis, so wet to dry, right? It needs to fill the vacuum, right? But it's also so fundamental that it's also the other way around, because you can say instead of wet to dry, it can be dryness to saturation, right? Like it's like X and Y, like think of like an axis. It's both like the way that the origin goes, the origin would be the ley line to the through line that is like going towards infinity, but infinity is also a ley line and can have a through line going like pointing towards.
So it's like ley line is the extreme, through line is the path from the extreme along the gradient.
That's another way of putting it. Yeah, extreme to like extrapolation, or like let's say like an axiom to a like conclusion or a whatever proof, or like 1 to 2, like yeah, like in a weird way, if yin and yang is to say like 0 and 1, ley lines to through lines is 1 to 2. Does that make any sense?
No, that's one.
Yeah, that one.
I thought I had you, but the last one.
Yeah, no, that last one is that. This is what I mean by like the idea. This is an idea that I've been like rolling around in my head for a while. Like that bridge now is what I'm trying to be able to connect through language. That's not just in my mind, but also through language, through English, of how ley lines and through lines is 1 and 2, as opposed to yin and yang is 0 and 1. Like 0 and 1 in terms of like binary, right? It's like it is there or it's not, right? Like 0 and 1, on or off, right? And 1 and 2 is like ley line and through line. Like there is a 1, like arbitrary point, limit, like this start, axiom,
okay,
whatever.
I think I'm starting to get it.
And 2 is like the next thing.
Where it went to.
Where like the 1 to 2, right? Like super fundamental like concept stuff. These are like that's the thing. Like yin and yang is so basic, but like Tao is basic because it's so basic that it can't have a name. You can't even say it.
Ley line is like there's a thing, and then through line is now it's going somewhere. Like to get very esoteric.
Like
it. So it's
it
like
is,
a thing is dry, and then the through line for dry is like it can become wet.
Yes. You're getting it.
Yeah.
This is one of those things that it's like you have to just like say examples because it's very obvious. It's so obvious.
It's annoying because it's like when people try to describe like Taoism and stuff.
Yes.
Like, the only lesson books or like explanation books, they're just a collection of like these annoying stories. Yeah. And you have to like just try and get it. That's like the definition process.
Oh my god. Yeah. Oh my god. That's so funny. Oh my. Yeah. It's. How do I say this? It's why Mr. Miyagi is annoying.
Yeah.
Because you can't fucking explain it easily. Like, how would you explain this general concept, this incredibly basic concept?
You gotta give a million little examples.
Yeah, like in
until
English.
Somebody starts to grasp the underlying similarity between them all.
If you can't like connect the dots and see it yourself, and like be a human, for example, like to a computer, I would have to like say like this is also like how. Like to even use English now, I would have to explain how there was like a moment before I was speaking that wasn't English to is English. So wasn't English is the ley line, and was or like happening of English, like right now speaking, is then the through line. You know what I mean? It's like it's that fundamental. So like how like you literally can't explain it to a computer like with English, because English itself is like English would be the speaking of the word the way versus trying to explain what Tao is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a very the more abstracted the thought, right, the harder it's going to be to explain to
Yeah.
like adding machine, you know.
Yeah. Bryan, I want to put you on the spot. Like pretend like we're recording the podcast and like all of what we just said was removed, and you have to catch up the audience. Like TLDR of what I mean by through line to ley line. Like you have to explain that to someone else. What the hell I mean by through line to ley line. Go.
Ley line is an arbitrary point or concept. Through line is the next thing that stems from having that arbitrary pointer.
The next thing that extends. That's beautifully put. But that's the thing, like that makes sense to me because like I already know what you mean.
You know the concept already.
But yeah, then to explain
and I can't
it,
go back in time to figure out if that makes sense to me now that I kind of know what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
We're screwed. We gotta find a new data point to introduce this to
Like there's
and see if
no
it works.
like because this definitionally is like what it like the predates the logical ability to have two data points. But definitionally, this is something that needs two data points at least to draw this line. Because it's like it's very line energy. Like yin and yang is like very dot energy, and like through lines and ley lines is very line energy.
That's hilarious.
But it's accurate, right? You get what I'm trying to say? It's very accurate. Okay, so I don't mean to blow your mind and jump too much around everywhere, but I think we've said everything that needs to be said about zero energy and line or dot energy and line energy, which is zeroth dimension or first one dimension to two dimensions, right? Dot to line. Dots are one dimension, lines are two dimensional, and my mind I think three dimensional is sort of boring because it's like, oh, we already got three dimension. We know, okay, so dot to line energy like makes sense, so that it implies that there must be
another
like two dimensional.
We want to complete our metaphor.
Exactly. Exactly. But the thing that I find interesting is then what the fuck is the idiom, the phrase, the like yin and yang or like through line and ley line or Tao, right? What is the Tao step of this? Like what is the zero of this, right? Like
zero of what?
Like what is the phrase for zero dimensional version of this?
Of ley line through line?
Yeah, and yin and yang. And I think it's actually Tao. Like Tao might be the 0th point. Like the way. It's like emptiness. That's Buddhism. That's like, oh no. Like silence. Like what would be edited out of a podcast. Like definition like
okay. So you're saying if you know yin and yang is dot energy and ley line through line is line energy, what is the canvas?
Yes, that's also Tao. That is zero energy.
Okay.
Exactly. You nailed it. What is the canvas? Canvas is very zero energy, right? And like instead of 0 to 1, it's like null.
I'm trying to think of a better term for it than zero energy, but
no, I mean zero energy totally tracks though, right? So it's also because it's like instead of 0 to 1, it's null to 0. Like the possibility to even have 0, like there must be null versus that, right? What's the difference between null, like NA, not applicable, and 0?
I don't have. For the listener, I'm just kind of like shrugging my shoulders while shaking my head a little bit and just kind of giving up. Just, I don't know.
Anyway, I feel like there's a lot to unpack with all that stuff, and maybe that's a future episode. But that's a kind of philosophy that I've been like trying to work with, right? Of like, how do we break things down this fundamentally, like conceptually? There must be more than yin and yang and Tao.
Yeah, well, I mean, and ley line through line now.
Yeah, I feel ley line through line.
That in there.
But that way's boring. Like to me, my brain doesn't like my brain gets bored faster with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 versus 1, 2, 0.
Yeah.
1 to
You
0.
want to, like, even it out
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah, it's
Like,
like,
oh, I
oh, okay,
already
like
went that direction,
1,
let's
2
go.
makes sense. All right, it's probably gonna be 3 next. But 0 is like, oh wait, no, it's the other way, right? Versus like 1, okay, and then 2, okay, the next one's probably the next number, which is 3, and then it goes to 3. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's 3, cool. Then it's probably 4, and I don't care anymore.
I think you just like have a personal fascination with what is it like? What are the axioms that are kind of like subsisting everything else?
But I
Because
think
you kind of do
actually,
that with a lot of stuff in your life, you know. That's not just this.
I agree. But also another way to look at it is, I like to subvert expectations.
There's like almost a connotation of going a level below. when
Yeah,
you say to
or
subvert something,
a
right?
level different. You know what I mean? Like instead of a level, if the expectation was for you to either go above or below, I would then go left or right.
Yeah.
Like a bend. This is if this was if all that other stuff was line energy, this is very like line with a bent line energy, curve energy. Does that make sense?
No.
Because instead of it just going down the same line, there's like a turn. There's a quirk to it, right?
You're just trying to go outside the box.
Exactly. That too. You got it.
I respect that, you know?
Would you say you're more of a straight line or a curve?
I'm more of a straight line.
Do you think engineers in general are a straight line?
Nah.
No, really? You don't think engineers tend to be straight line versus curve?
Like by majority, but I think with your definitions, by majority, most of everything is straight line.
No, I would say like in terms of professions, like artists, musicians, philosophers,
Okay.
like that kind of those fields would be much more bent energy, curve energy.
Most engineers, pretty straight line.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. What is most zero energy in terms of professions?
In terms of professions?
Yeah.
People who are
religion?
selectively purposefully homeless, like hermit.
Yeah,
like,
Diogenes is
Diogenes is
very zero energy. So what else? Like I would say like religious figures, right? Zero energy. I would say arguably less so. Not as extreme, of course, but not as extreme zero energy,
it
but
might be
more
something
zero
further
energy.
down the line in a different direction. Like they might be a 2 or a 3 type energy. We haven't fully defined those
No,
yet.
I don't think so. I think because two are like that's the spectrum, right? It's on the spectrum of bent to straight. There's also the spectrum of like 1 to 2, right? And like that's just like the in between, right?
Well, okay, so let me draw it out then a little bit more because I think the religious thing, because it's existing on more of like a human moral sort of axiom, I think it's a little bit more of like a, if we have like one dimension energy, right, line energy, when you introduce that like flatlander, like 2D type thing.
Okay, yeah. I love that. Oh my god, I love flatland. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I think like when you have that flatlander 2D existence, that's where things like religion probably step in a little bit more.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, actually, yeah. So like, if I could put it poetically, I think religion is a leap of faith and it being rewarded, which is like 0, 1, so like 1, 2, 3, right? While like all of what I was talking about, like subverting expectations, is like if you had taken that leap of faith, you would have been punished. Like instead of 1, 2, 3, I was right, I was rewarded religion. 1, 2, 0. Like, wait, what? I thought it was 3. Where are we going with this now? Right?
I guess I was thinking about it more in terms of, to use the full definitions again for like ley line through line, how it's sort of you have a concept and you have the thing that stems from the concept.
Yeah, line.
Like the next abstraction to me is like, okay, so you have many concepts.
Longer
now.
line.
Well, yeah, not just longer line, but like
Oh,
you have to
third, like
yeah,
yeah,
like
second dimension,
many
two-dimensional.
concepts that you need to now navigate within.
Like
Right?
you have
there's
a line.
many concepts going many places, and they mean different things. You've
Right.
got all these gradients and shades, and you've got to sort of
Yeah,
interact with that space somehow.
Yeah, gradients and
And
shades.
so that's why like the abstraction feels like that next step that you take, where it's like it's no longer just like yin and yang of like things are and aren't, and then you take that next step of like, okay, you have a specific concept within that space, which then
Yeah.
implies and grows into other stuff. And then the next step is like you have many of these things, and you need to figure out some
It's
way
plane
to exist
energy.
within that.
Like 2D,
Yeah.
it's a plane now. You have a line, and now we have an infinite amount of lines, and we're in that plane, that dimension of an infinite amount of lines. Oh, that's something that I learned not too long ago of dimension, right? Like that field that is the two-dimensional, like two-dimension. Dimension predates is like a predecessor of logic in terms of like now planes, right?
Dimension is a predecessor of logic, you said.
So planes and fields, right, are all dimensions,
Mm-hmm.
right? But a dimension can also be applied to like your personality, like you're multidimensional. But that's not constructed of planes and lines, right? That's like a different thing. But dimension is in the concept of dimension is like not predates, like is a predecessor logically, I guess. Does that make sense? This stuff is hard to explain.
I'm gonna segue.
This stuff is hard to explain. Anyway, yeah, keep going. Please segue.
The other day, for whatever reason, I was like thinking of the word environment. And I think it was because of this like sketch that I watched where like it's talking about like the front fell off of a boat. It's a funny sketch. I'll send it to you after. You should watch it.
Okay.
But anyway, at one point he says like, oh, like, you know, it's not a problem. It's outside the environment. And the guy's like, what do you mean? Like it's the front fell off your oil tanker. Like it's a problem for somewhere. He's like, no, we took the boat, we moved it outside the environment. He's like, to another environment. He's like, no, it's outside the environment. And so I like looked up the etymology, like a definition for environment, and the definition for environment is like very not satisfying.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like this should be a very clear term.
Yeah.
And then so I looked up the etymology for it, and the etymology for environment is also like not super. It's like environ, which is like viron is like some sort of French for like surround. So it's to like it was odd. It really made me think of the word environment differently. So like I guess it comes from some let me look it up actually. It's like some French root of the word surround. And etymology.
Fuck, there's a term.
Yes.
I'm trying so hard to remember. There's
Iron
a weird
surround, encircle, or encompass. And then mint is just a common suffix of Latin origins. Originally from French and representing Latin mentum, which was added to verb stems to make nouns indicating the result or product of the action. So it's like the result or product of surrounding something, but it kind of took on this other like sort of context as language developed, because like back the 1887 version of it from some dictionary for environmental is like environing or surrounding.
Environing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's almost just to say like the environment is whatever is surrounding.
So
that you're talking.
For just the listeners who can't see, right? My jaw dropped because like that is sort of, I can totally see like I see why that is so interesting to you, because like that is so interesting to me of like for example, nickname, right, is like a bastardization of two different words from two different languages. Like name, like it's not like the origin isn't like, oh, there was a guy named Nicholas and he was named Nick and that was his nickname. So like
That's where it comes from.
like
Yeah,
that's what it means to be. That's not where it's from. Like that's sort of like what I thought it was, and that's wrong, right? I assumed it was sort of like that. It's like, oh, Nick is an English word, name is an English word. It's probably like that's where it came from.
Yeah.
No, apparently, and I could be entirely wrong about this, but in this history, etymology history is applicable to a different word. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Nick is a bastardization vocally to like the words like close or like false, like wrong, right? Like this is like not, I guess, like not name, like not their name.
Yeah, so
right?
it's like false name or not name or like
Yeah.
close to name type
Right,
thing.
but that the sound basically is a bastardization when put in English together sounds like nickname so it got shortened that the concept of the word nickname is just this word.
Is now what the word is.
Yeah. It's sort of also like why like German has like a single concept, a single word that is like 7 fucking words crammed together. Like Schadenfreude, right?
Yeah, it's highly specific.
Yeah, it's like just like emotions and pain and others. Like those 3 words like mushed together is Schadenfreude. Like simply put. You know what I mean?
Isn't that so interesting?
Like that. This is our culture. It's like the first point you were talking about before, like how we fall ass backwards to being right. Like I guess like that's not what you meant by nickname, but it's right. So no one told me that's not what the history of nickname is.
Like, we both knew what we were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So, oh my god, wait. I forgot. I don't have to mute myself because we're editing. This is so much better. Like I don't have to worry about like having to mute and like shifting gears. Like I'm
gonna mean that you have to listen back to the thing.
Right, but I was gonna do that anyway, which I guess is more incentivizing me to not dick around too much. But the thing is, I think that's a how do the Buddhists put it? A question asked out of bad faith, I think. Something like that. It's that kind of energy. But basically, it's like, that question is just, the question is wrong. You know what I mean? Anyway, I wanted to segue. There was something I wanted to talk about. I don't remember how it came up. But on the most recent episode of Joe Rogan, have you watched it?
No, I haven't watched in ages, honestly.
Oh my god. He had a amateur journalist, but quickly becoming professional journalist because he's covering the Coke company and a bunch of other stuff with our food. Coca-Cola and the company that was behind Orange 6 or something like that, like the pesticide, like a big chemical company, right? And their history. And it's, first of all, so fucking interesting. The guy that was talking about it was really came from a good place and non-biased place. Of no, okay, I've heard all these terrible things about Coke, as we all have, and it's a terrible company and destroying people and or environments, and we all know about whatever. Enough about the company, right? The what's it called? The journey that this guy goes through to say okay, what's their let's give them their fair shake. Where did they come from? Why did they make these decisions? What actually happened? What did they do to make through it? How did that actually enable this thing to happen? And there's all these stories of I forgot which company it was. Great podcast. Basically the chemical waste product was later on sold from one of these companies as insulation, filler, construction filler, right? And it's usually used in basements and stuff like that. But the thing is, and it's wild. If anyone's at least any tech savvy or has watched a Marvel movie with the Incredible Hulk, some of these fucking basements were emitting low levels of gamma radiation. Gamma, those are really big. That's a big deal. Those are really high energy wavelengths. You know what I mean? That can really not so inconsequentially cause cancer and stuff like that, right?
I
And
mean,
there
that
were people
sounds
that,
pretty wild.
but the thing is, like, the companies, like, so the journalist does such a good work about, like, saying, like, okay, but, like, they didn't know that. The people, like, it's not
Right.
just like nameless company, faceless company. It's like full of people that, like, and they're not all evil. Like, the company as an aggregate might have been evil and, like, did really bad stuff, but, like, and some of the, like, leaders in charge, right? The corruption is, the fish always stinks from the head, right?
Yeah.
And, like, the so what did they do? How did they respond to this? Right? Like, what about the good people?
How did that come to be?
And
Right?
how did that come
Like,
to be? Right? Like, you can go both directions, right? And, like, that the well runs deep, dude.
sounds like it might be worth listening to. It's mostly this journalist talking about the Coca-Cola stuff.
Yeah, and there's another company which, oh, I guess since we can
I find that I mean, historically those have always been my favorite JRE episodes. I think I stopped listening for so long now, in part because they were becoming very few and far between. Where
yeah,
he actually just had on like somebody who was an expert in some particular thing, and he let them just like
yeah. So
talk about their stuff for a while.
it's starting to become way more interesting now because during COVID he just had way less, guests that could fly in, and a lot of these, like, really good guests that are willing to fly in, of course, because I would love to, be on a Jerry. So most of these other people would too, right? And
Mhm.
they just couldn't fly in before, so it was just like people that he's already had that, and everyone was also, distracted by that giant elephant that was covering everything in the room, you know.
Yeah.
Oh man. So Bryan, thanks so much for chatting with me today. Yeah, I don't want to record. Okay, I guess this is a little teaser for if this somehow makes it into the podcast. I don't want to record talking about the game that I'm making. Codename Peonis. It is the code name, right? It is the nickname, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's end this recording. Thanks for listening if you listened, I guess.